mean, it might be an answer that you're not a fan of from what I've heard earlier.
No, please.
Honestly, it's a couple of things. One is that, and like I said, you might hate this answer. It's when someone is being truly and authentically themselves, they're exactly what they're creating is a real reflection of either how they feel, what they think, and they're not chasing, what is the latest trend or what is the popular thing to do and what is the, it's not that. It's that they're actually, whatever they're creating is like really true to like what they're doing, what they feel, what they think. And I've always seen that, that's where real like sort of creativity like thrives.
So, hello to the good people, the noble viewers on the internet. Today we have with us Mae Thomas. She definitely doesn't need an introduction. She's the founder of Made in India, India's first music podcast. To sum up what she doesn't do, you'll need her. I'll not talk, which I generally do. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining in. It means a lot, very lot.
Awesome. Nice to meet you too.
So right now you're in India or outside UK?
No, I'm actually in Bombay. I've lived I've been back in India since like 2010.
2010, yeah. I was reading that. Like you started as a journalist, as a news editor in a community radio show in Wales, and then you shifted back.
I did. Sorry, go on.
No, please.
No, sorry. Please finish your question. Sorry.
Okay. Normally, I was reading through a lot of portals that you started as a news editor, journalist in Wales. So, how come this shift happened from a journalist to an entrepreneur, a founder of a production company like this? So, take us through that, or take me through that.
I've been working, at least had been working in the radio space for the longest time. And journalism was definitely something that I wanted to pursue, and it's something that I pursued in my master's degree. And the thing is, I still do love radio and love journalism. But when I moved back to India, because it was a difficult time. Like I graduated when the recession happened. It wasn't easy to get a job like in the UK. And then I was covering the elections. And then the Tory government, the Conservatives won, and I was like, it's time for me to leave. Gotta go back to my own country. Because I knew it was going to become much harder for me to try to get a visa. Mm-hmm. So I came back to India and I realized that I basically couldn't get a job as a journalist for a radio station unless it was AIR. So basically in India, private commercial radio stations aren't allowed to report the news. Only a public funded station, which is AIR. So I, as a journalist, couldn't like go to Red FM and report the news because you can't report the news. I thought that was so strange. It was such an archaic sort of regulation and law that it didn't make any sense, but I still wanted to continue to work in radio. So I started out in Chennai and then moved to Bombay, and I had like a small stint working for now erstwhile publication N87.in, this alternative culture publication that I used to work for briefly. And then I moved back into radio again because I missed it a lot. And I worked for Radio 1 in Bombay for about three and a half years. And then I got really jaded by radio because I felt quite stifled creatively. I wasn't able to really pursue the things that I really wanted to do. And maybe I couldn't really work in a very corporate kind of structure. So that's when I started freelancing for about a year. And during that time, I got approached to make a podcast. And that's when I, had thought of like doing like an indie music podcast, which was Made in India. And at the time, it was exciting because, none of the radio stations were really covering independent music in the way that I wanted to. Like, I wanted to bring artists into the studio, do live sessions with them, things like that. And I felt like that didn't really exist in Indian radio in the same way. And then I was working as the creative director for a podcasting company for about 2 years. I kind of wanted to pursue something different. I'd left them. And then eventually I wanted to take my own podcast independently, which is why I took it out of the company I was with previously. And at the time, I was very like on a mission to like keep my show going, which is always really hard. But in that whole throes of like trying to keep Made in India alive, I started to get approached to handle the production of other people's podcasts because they knew me from the podcasting space and having made shows and all that. So I very much call myself a reluctant entrepreneur because it's not something that I really wanted to do. And even now, I'm still like, I don't call myself like a businesswoman or something like that. I am very much like not a typical, sort of, CEO of a company, that kind of thing. Because I'm also like an unfunded company, I'm also like pursuing a lot of what I'm doing literally independently. I sometimes feel like I'm a little too indie for my own good. But in what like I was trying to do is that I wanted to work with, interesting people. I loved, when someone had a good idea, I wanted to do something differently, believed in like how we were going to do things. And I had like a sort of vision of that. And even now, like, I've been quite reluctant about taking funding, but I still want to pursue, doing this and working with people. So I think a lot of like what at least me and my partner have been working towards is that, yes, I do run my own business now, but is it the thing that I want to do? Not really, because the business world and running a business, right? Like the way the ecosystem of business or entrepreneurship functions is not really meant for creative people. Like when creative people are running their own business, it's like the business world isn't conducive for creativity at all. And not in the way that will actually keep it going or keep it thriving and push it forward. I think that's the thing that I've always struggled with a lot. That if you see something good and you see a great idea and it's worth investing in, it's not necessarily the thing that's going to bring you the numbers and be massy or anything like that. So yeah, it's something that I do definitely struggle with regularly. But if I could, I still miss radio. I still miss journalism because it was definitely something that I started my career off with. But I've also really enjoyed, doing projects that I've really wanted to do and the people that I've worked with and so on when I've been running my own business.
That description leaves me speechless. When you started this production company, when did you think that, okay, I can turn this from your first episode till now? You have more than 250 episodes, as I saw. How did you sit down and think, okay, this can be turned into an organization, a company, maybe?
So actually, I have over 300 episodes out. I released my 300 episode at the end of February. I did this like really big episode with a sort of iconic band called Zero. Who the irony of which is that like I never did my college here, so they were really big for like everyone who was my age but did college in India, and then I only discovered them when I came back. But so my 300th episode, I've actually released it at the end, and then I have over 300 episodes out, which is so exciting for me. So Made in India as a show isn't exactly a huge part of my business. It's very much a personal investment and a huge personal investment because running a music show is really expensive. If you can imagine, as a musician, you probably maybe release like a 4-song EP, once in every 2 years. And with Made in India, I release like a 3 to 4 song EP every week. So it's really, really expensive to mix and master music. It's also a huge investment to be able to get artists, record them, do video. It's like the miniest version of Coke Studios you possibly could think of. It's a lot. And so for me, that's not the biggest part of my business. That's actually quite a small, it's like my sort of my little passion of like what I really believe in and what I'm working really hard to support. The thing that's actually the majority of my business is the podcast production house, as well as the consultancy that I run in the podcast space. So that's mainly been it. So with regards to like how do I convert Made in India, my podcast, into a business, that's not the business. The business is like a completely separate thing.
Separate thing. Wow. From your experience of decades in the radio and journalism industry, if a journalist is hearing this session right now, what have you as an experienced journalist and an editor has seen the drawbacks and the benefits of being in both of these industries, the journalism and as well as the podcasting industry?
I mean, I'll tell you one thing. I mean, as a journalist, I've only mainly worked in the space of like radio, and like a little bit of like the journalism in the podcast space, because we've done a lot of nonfiction stuff. So I will say one thing is that when I was doing journalism for radio, I really enjoyed it. I loved like, seeking out stories and getting information and leads and following them and doing my research and finding an angle that no one had ever seen before. So I think as a journalist, you're always seeking out, there is like this innate curiosity that you have, that you want to know what is happening. And that sort of drives you towards, I guess you could say, drives you towards the truth, or at least for me, it drives me towards understanding people's intentions, or understanding a story, or understanding someone's experience or something. So I think that's always what journalists are trying to find. They're trying to find the story, they're trying to find the truth, they're trying to find information. So I think that's the thing that kind of drives you and that pushes you forward. And I think with the difference between radio and podcasting journalism is that there is like a relative immediacy that's there in radio. And I feel with podcasting, you can really take your time to create something, because with any broadcast media, especially radio, maybe a little more so than TV, is that you literally push a fader up and you're like live on air. And so it's like, you have to be able to talk, you have to be able to know what you're trying to say. And the difference between that and podcasting is that it's not live. You get to, like, that was like the one great luxury that I realized about podcasting. Like when I was in radio, I was like, I just did the interview at 12 o'clock and it's going on air at 2. I had 2 hours to like record, edit something down, and from a 20-minute interview to like 2-minute, bite-sized clips that I can like play on the radio. Like that's the immediacy of radio. But the difference between that and podcasting is that you have like, sometimes I have like 3 months to do a production, and I've spent 2 years on one production, for example, because there's so much research and there's script writing and there's sound designers, there are interviews, there are so many things that go into making it. And I've done fiction, I've done nonfiction. So like my thing in this space is that the difference is that like as a journalist, when you're thinking of like reportage that you're doing, I think it's the story that you're trying to find. And I think the audio medium always, in my opinion, has a way of allowing you to have like maybe a more nuanced conversation about being able to, create something without having to necessarily, because I feel like video is so much more intensive and maybe a much bigger investment in terms compared to audio. I also feel like the audio medium, the one thing that is one really great advantage is that anonymity can become an important thing, especially when you're a journalist and maybe someone doesn't want to be named, and you're still giving them a voice. So I think I think those are the kind of things that I would draw on with regards to journalism, at least in the audio space.
Because the thing I've noticed in your show is those are kind of the very creative shows I've ever watched and heard. Because you just not only talk with the musician, you also record the songs. It's kind of a 10 shows in one kind of an experience for the viewer, right? Because it's so immersive. How did this idea came about that I'll do this show, not like just a regular show that happens, you come and talk and then you go your way, my way. We'll just come and have this immersive experience. How did you think about this one? Because I can imagine only what kind of work does this take to execute and edit and all of that.
Yeah. I think at the time, I think one of the things that I realized was like a really important part of the show was that, most musicians, even like some of the relatively biggish ones, not all of them have recorded music, or they're always like working on something, and everything's in a sort of, stage where it's like sort of unfinished.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I realized is that for anyone, so the core idea behind Made in India is like literally just one thing. The one thing that's the most important part of Made in India that's always going to stay true is that it is a place to discover music. And that's the one thing that I always bring it down to. I'm like, what is Made in India? It is about discovering music. And that's it. It's like literally that simple. So everything that I've created, like the sort of ecosystem or the show or everything that like we're gearing towards always like comes down to this one thing. Yeah. So whether it's like, why can't I just, get artists, like just play some of their songs and then have them talk? It's because not everyone has recorded music. Like a really great example is a singer-songwriter called Alicia Pays, who's been in the industry for more than a decade. And she's so well known. And, one of the things that I found so difficult was that like, I can't believe she has no real recorded music out. And so there are a lot of artists that have that have performed live for years, but never actually penned down something. I mean, penned it down in the sense like produced it and released it. And so one of the things that I felt like was important was them to perform the music live. I also wanted the show to have a different element to it because I love live music, was that I wanted to have the artists like actually perform their songs. So they're slightly different renditions than what you would hear on their album.
Yeah.
For example, someone like J Babe, whose music is so highly produced, he does this like raw, stripped down version of his songs that you wouldn't really be able to hear anywhere else. And so I wanted that element to it. I wanted the show to represent something different of the artist. It's still their music, but it's just a slightly different rendition of that song that you could probably listen to on Spotify or something. The other was that, of course, like I wanted to know, because I'm a bit of a nerd about music, so I want to know the origin story of that song. What was the story behind it? Why use this lyric, and what was this bit, and why did it sound like this, or why does this symbol sound so weird? Oh, it broke at a live gig and so I kept it that way. Like whatever, like there are all these like really nice stories around why the music was created in this way. And the other is also to understand the artist a little better. You get to know the musician. So even if you've never heard of Fossil, like this some absolutely random band that I discovered, but their music is so incredible, or you've never heard of Low Peninsula or something, then you would be like, oh my God, who are these guys? Yeah. And so you would never know who they are, but then you get to learn about who they are and get to understand their music. The one thing that probably holds me back in some ways, the fact that music is unbelievably subjective. So the music that one person likes isn't necessarily the music that someone else likes. So I never truly know, but most of our audience is always, people who are like, oh my God, I want to hear this like whole band and I want to see who they are and what they're doing. And so I think for me, music discovery is like absolutely at its core. And then everything that I'm doing is about helping you get to know the artist, and you get to like understand why this song was made in this way, and you kind of break it down a little bit, get a little nerdy about it, because I'm a bit of a nerd too. So I think that was always those are like sort of the aspects of why the show is what it is today. And I also feel like like there's no one kind of episode. So there is the live studio stuff, the studio sessions that we do. We also have this thing called mixtapes that I started some years ago, because a lot of the artists can't always come to Bombay to record. So I started these mixtapes where because I used to get also so many submissions of music of artists from all over the country. And there were such like, there was this shoegaze band from Chandigarh that were like super cool. And I'm like, oh my God, I have to put this song on my show. So I think in that regard, that's how the mixtape started. And, I think the show also is a huge representation of me because of what I feel and what I think and my sort of political opinion sometimes. And so I think a lot of that comes through, and it comes through in various ways. Like, for example, when the pandemic had hit, the first thing that happened was that India started getting into border disputes with everyone. And like the whole world is
India
like in a
being
pandemic,
India.
and India's like China border, Nepal, they have a problem with this one. I'm like, what is happening?
Shut
And I
up.
was so irritated by this. Like, and I was so like, I can't believe, like, when we're all supposed to be coming together and helping each other, that this is what's happening. And so I wanted to sort of talk about that, but in the best way that I knew how, which is through music. So I contacted like independent musicians from Pakistan and Nepal and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. And I asked them, I love their music. I said, hey, I would love to feature you on my podcast because I think your music is super cool. And they were game. And I did this entire series that I did for the last 2 years called Our Neighbors. And the idea was to literally showcase music from our neighbors. And again, that is very much me having a particular political stance of like what I feel like we should represent camaraderie and brotherhood and sisterhood, and not have to be,
Fighting
allow border
over.
tensions and these kind of like sort of politics. To like govern the way we feel about other people. And so I think that was really important to me. More recently, I did this thing called the Ladies Special, where I had this like Carnatic musician. Well, she is like a really interesting artist. She does a sort of a fusion, but it's not exactly a kind of fusion. But I got to ask her a question, which I'm assuming that not many people get asked, in the space that she's in, which is that there is like this guru shishya relationship within any classical space, whether it's Carnatic, Hindustani, or whatever. And one of the things is that this guru shishya has a power dynamic. And I wanted to ask her, and I did, about, there are a lot of stories, where women are treated a particular way because of this power dynamic. And she really opened up about what had happened to her and others that she knew. And so it's these kind of things that I think are so important to put out there. I had an interview with Swaratma, who talked about having suffered a huge loss during the pandemic, as many artists did. And one of the most interesting things that they did was that they had kept some money aside for a rainy day. And they were like, that became like a small, tiny salary for us to survive like the pandemic, because we kept some money aside for a rainy day. So all these things are, for me, like really important to put out there, because those are the conversations I want to have. And I am relatively unafraid of having them. And of course, like if you make someone feel comfortable enough, they will be okay to open up, because you are, and that's the test of a really great journalist. It's that, when you have what you call a source, right, you have to protect them because they're opening up about something that they're afraid to tell anyone else. And so you have to safeguard them and their story, which is what makes you a good journalist, which gives you the ability to be able to tell that they trust that you will tell their story well enough. And so I think that's another sort of like key thing for me of like being able to have these conversations also is because I know that I'm going to look after their story that they're telling me. So, yeah.
Well, I'm asking you one question, and while you answer, all of my two questions are getting answered. So that's the you are the kind of at the peak of journalism right now.
Am I? I don't think I'm at the peak. There are various other BBC or CNN journalists that are way ahead of me. Even like non-mainstream journalists are like way ahead of me. I'm very like small to go comparison.
You've had words and you have had conversations with a lot of artists, musicians, creative individuals, entrepreneurs, innovators from all fields. According to you, from that experience, what makes a creative individual successful and what doesn't?
I mean, it might be an answer that you're not a fan of from what I've heard earlier.
No, please.
Honestly, it's a couple of things. One is that, and like I said, you might hate this answer. It's when someone is being truly and authentically themselves, they're exactly what they're creating is a real reflection of either how they feel, what they think, and they're not chasing, what is the latest trend or what is the popular thing to do and what is the, it's not that. It's that they're actually, whatever they're creating is like really true to like what they're doing, what they feel, what they think. And I've always seen that, that's where real like sort of creativity like thrives. And the other is that I think this is like when I've like heard or seen or watched something or, listened to something that I feel like, wow, this is so different. When you're creating something and you have a really good idea or you're doing something like, oh my God, I this is how it is. I think a lot of people just go with like the first thing that they thought of and then that's it. But in actuality, creativity takes a lot of work. It's so much work. And you think that the first thing only that's the thing that, creativity is a really strange thing. It's that sometimes you could make something in 20 minutes and it's amazing. And you could work 3 years on something and it still not feel good enough. So I feel like it doesn't that you have to take like 10 years to work on something great. I've seen amazing things be made in the smallest span of time and still have true meaning because it just came flowing out of them because something sparked. It's so difficult. And so I think that creativity is equal amounts of like you being able to do what it is that you feel like expresses you and what you're feeling in the best possible way. But I also think it takes a lot of hard work. Like creativity isn't just like some easy peasy thing that you just make and then everyone will love it. No, it's a lot of hard work. I think that you have to put in as well, that you have to put into your craft, that you have to put into what you're making. Like one of the things that I've always like sort of spoken to people about is like the moment when someone wants to create a podcast, right? The first thing I ask them is like, can you name some of the podcasts that you really like?
Yeah.
And they've like, oh, I haven't really heard that many podcasts. It's like someone who's a filmmaker telling me they never heard a film.
So it's kind of like a wishful thinking rather than a practical one.
Pardon?
That's kind of that kind of thing.
But
that kind of thinking is kind of a wishful thing that okay, I want to do this, but
No, it isn't wishful thinking. That's what I was trying to say, that one of the things that are super important is to actually knowing and honing your craft.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So like one of the key things, if you want to make a podcast, but I've never heard a podcast before, or at least not even heard like 5 podcasts, it's like a filmmaker saying they've never watched a film before.
Yeah.
You know, the reason why like Tarantino's so great is because he's an unbelievable nerd. You
Yeah.
know, he is an uber nerd about, he will tell you some obscure horror film that inspired like a scene from a particular, you know, something that he wrote. So my thing is that like whenever I've spoken to people who have just started making a podcast, the first thing I ask them is like, have you heard? Like I just recently had that conversation. Someone wanted to make like a food podcast. And I'm like, have you heard any food podcasts? And they were like, no. And I'm like, you should. And I
That's the
recommended
homework.
some ones that I really like. Yeah, there's some amazing shows out there. It surprises me that when someone wants to create something, like if you want to create music and you've never heard a song before,
How will you
I'm
create?
like, how can you make something that you don't even understand what you can understand what a song is, but if you've never heard, like
Yeah.
you have to listen to some music at least.
Mm-hmm.
You know, even if you've not listened to every song in the world, you still have to listen to some.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the thing that I find so surprising. So like when I'm saying that like what creativity isn't like I make something and it becomes big. It's like you have to make something, you have to work at it, you have to work at understanding yourself and understanding your craft. Like there is a lot of work that goes into creativity. It isn't like just the easiest thing that like, okay, I make something and it's like, you know. So my thing is like that's at least what I've seen that's been, you know, when people have been their most creative. And I also think that, by the way, it's a hit and miss. I've known people who've had like who created something and it's amazing, but like the second thing that they created wasn't really as good as the first one, and then the third thing was even better than the first two. So there is no consistency. There isn't like you're making one great thing after another, one great painting, one great show, one
Yeah.
great episode. No. I always think that like, you know, there's so many other things that factor into like what becomes really popular or what becomes great. You know, I also think some of the most creative things aren't the most popular things,
Yeah.
right?
I
Like
agree.
whenever people think of like what makes something creative successful, I'm like, but some of the most creative things I don't think are successful.
Yeah.
I
I
think
agree.
that, you know, it's a very, in my opinion, a very myopic way of thinking of creativity. So, in my opinion, you can be unbelievably creative and make something that I think is glorious. I'm like, oh my God, this is amazing. But then also it not be well known or renowned. You know, there's so many amazing artists, musicians, creators, all that who are making something that I think, you know, inspires me or makes me think differently. But by no means are they at all successful.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think like, I mean, but that's my definition of creative. A lot of people are like, well, if you're not successful, then you're not good
Yeah.
enough.
Those people are business people. Those who say something
It
like this.
doesn't even have to be business people. There are people who are musicians who, you know, who also think that like I'm not successful till I make like $1 million or something, or I'm known in like outside Indian markets. Like there are perfectly non-business people who think the same way too. I mean, a really great example was Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol was someone who felt like you couldn't be a good artist if everyone didn't know your art, which is why like that sort of pop art culture, he was merchandising before anyone was. Like it's so there are people that are unbelievably creative people that also understand what it means to be truly successful and like also find the formula for it. And Andy Warhol is a great example of that. So my thing is that it doesn't have to be a business person at all.
Wow, that's a really good answer. I was like searching for. um,
I hope so. I don't know if it's a right answer, but it's an answer.
it's an answer, yeah. Duh. How do you handle criticisms yourself?
Um, Sometimes with a pinch of salt, really. I think that firstly, it depends who it's coming from.
Yeah.
I think when we get criticized, it really depends who is criticizing us. I do think that matters a lot. It's very different if someone on the road that you barely know criticizes you versus your parents, versus your best friend, versus a business associate, versus a junior colleague, who criticizes you or is critiquing anything that you're doing. I think that who it is does matter, because it is whether you respect them, whether you trust their opinion, whether they understand you and where you're coming from. I think that you can be critical of someone's work and still, you know, you can tell them in a way that is more understanding and more empathetic. You can also be extremely brutal. I've been really brutal to people. They've been brutal to me. But I think that when I say with a pinch of salt, it kind of factors in everything. It factors in who this person is, how they've told you, what have they told you that really matters to you, because I think that some criticism can crush you if it catches you at the wrong time.
Yeah.
Especially when you're going through something or any kind of like sort of mental turmoil or an existential crisis of some sort. But then I've also had someone like be critical and tell me something, and it's challenged me, or maybe it's made me think differently, and I'm like, oh, I never thought of it that way. I should try that. And so I think it really depends. But like I said, if you're going to get any criticism, take it with a pinch of salt. Like, see who it's coming from. See what they're telling you and why they're telling you. Understand the criticism as much as you possibly can. I would say if someone's giving you a piece of criticism, I'm not saying question it, but ask them questions about what they're trying to tell you.
Yeah.
So if they're like, well, I didn't really like what you did. Oh, can you tell me why? What was it in particular? And then understand, firstly, what they're trying to communicate to you. And also, like, sort of break it down so that you can truly understand where it's coming from, So then when you understand it, you can either take it and, implement it, or take a bit of it and implement it, or don't take anything at all, because you're like, I get where you're coming from, but I'm not sure it's right for me right now. And I've had like someone like give me a critique that I may not have worked for me at the time that I heard it, but then maybe worked for me 5 years later. And I'm like, oh, I remember that person told me this. I should try that right now. And so, yeah, that's basically how I feel. I'm not averse to it. And I'll tell you this, whether it's my team, whether it's like people that I know really well, people that I don't know, I love it when people have the ability to challenge you, because I love that sparring. Like, I'm unafraid. Like, even with my team, I encourage them. If they don't like my idea, I'm like, tell me why. I'd love to know. And like, I love that sparring, because I think that great things come out of when you actually are open enough to other people telling you things, and you're not like in this sort of bubble.
Yeah.
So I love it. I love it when someone can really spar with me, and they well, I think this idea works for this reason or doesn't work for that reason. And, I really enjoy that. But yeah, that's only because I like a good, I like it when like someone is like challenging you and you're like, okay,
let's push the limits now.
What was that about? Well, this, and then it also gives me reason to defend why I think something works. And if I realize that someone else is right, I'm like, oh, that's actually a fair point. Okay, I'll take that into consideration. So like, I've had moments where they've criticized me, but it's allowed me to defend what I was doing. So then it even more cements how I feel about what I did or what I created. So I feel like that I don't know, it actually gives me more confidence because sometimes, and I I don't think I would necessarily completely lose confidence. It's not like I've not gotten criticism and then just been like, oh, why? Why is this happening to me? But then to give me some encouragement, I've gone to people who I know will also give me support, because sometimes when you get criticism, it can hurt, or maybe you don't understand why you're getting it. And then talking to someone who you know is your champion and who will support you regardless. Sometimes you need a little bit of that. So I feel like we always need a little bit of both. Yeah.
Wow, that's philosophy in a nutshell.
Wow. I should write a book, right?
The last question of the entire session. From your entire experience of working in different areas, three advices to all the creative individuals out there, whether they're a poet, a musician, a journalist, a producer, entrepreneur, whatever they are.
Number one, if you have an idea, like whatever it may be, but you're kind of not sure about it, sometimes you have an idea and you're like, oh, this sounds amazing. And like, I think one of the things that I think is super important is that we always get afraid to pursue something because we don't know how good it's going to be. And I've always been in a space where I'm like, just do it. It might work, it might not work, but till you do it, you will never know. And
Yeah.
so I always feel like you should just do it. Even if you have to invest a little money in it. Like I think people are always afraid to put even 1 rupee into their own idea, but they will fight to get someone else to put money in it. And I'm like,
Yeah.
no, you kind of have to invest first in your own idea. So I think putting your money where your mouth is allows you to convince other people to put money in it too. That's one for sure. And then, whatever that you pursue, it might work, it might not work, but that's okay. So that's like one, like if you have an idea, just roll with it, whatever happens. But if you have to really believe in it, and even if you're not sure about it, try it, see if it works. If it doesn't work, then you can always push it aside and try something else.
At
But
least
like
you
if you have an
tried.
idea, I'm always like, throw it down. Yeah, at least you've tried and you've seen whether it worked or not. The second is don't be afraid, like especially when you're starting out with something, don't be afraid to like pull favors. I think one of the things is that we isolate ourselves a lot when you're a creative person.
Mm-hmm.
And when you isolate yourself away from other people's opinions, which I think may be good for some in the creative process, but it might also could be to your detriment. I would say that if you also need help, favors, whatever it may be, I'm like, when you're starting out, you should pull it then, And I promise you, people are always in a space where they want to help, especially if you ask. And if
Yeah.
they don't want to help you, there are other people. You want to go to like one person, you can go to many. And so my thing is that like my second piece of advice would be like, please, like if you have friends, family, random people that have like I've had like wonderful people in my life who've helped me, and I've asked them for help. Like when I first started a podcast production company, I had no idea how I was going to distribute podcasts, right? Because when you're doing your distribution, I was like, oh, I don't know. I don't even know how to upload the file and what is the metadata stuff and all that. I didn't
Yeah.
know any of it really. And I could Google it. But then I also knew a tech guy that I used to work with in a podcasting company, and he left around about the same time that I did. So I had this moment where like I didn't really know how to distribute a podcast. And there was a tech guy that I used to know at the previous podcasting company that I worked at. And so I just called him and I just asked him if he could help me and take me through how to distribute a show. And he was so unbelievably sweet and so helpful. And it was thanks to him that I was able to know how to handle and distribute a show. And so my thing is that like, you can always ask people for help. Some people are open and willing to help you. Some people might not. Some people might be like, can you pay me a little bit because it's my bread and butter, but I'm happy to help. So maybe you might have to pay them a little bit of money, you know, and it depends. So my thing is that like pull as many favors as you can. Ask people for help because it will hold you in good stead when you're eventually going to pursue something or put something out there. And my last piece of advice, this is like I feel very like life coachy, but I think and this again is maybe because of the position I'm in now and the fact that there is currently like an economic downturn, is that please do your best to like put aside a little money during like a difficult time.
Yes.
I think that's something that, especially when you're a creative person, you kind of go all in sometimes. And I would say try to keep some, whatever money that you earn, like put some aside for a rainy day because it'll really help, especially when there's no work coming your way or no one's investing in stuff. And that's really helped me and helped my partner and helped our company in so many ways, like buffer through like a really tough period, especially at this time when like we had the pandemic and this like terrible economy. So I would say, and I've never given this advice of like financial stability before, but I would highly recommend like just keeping a little money aside for yourself, even if it's like 1,000 rupees a month or something like that, but just something. And it'll really help. Like suddenly one day, like this money will pop back into your account or something, and you'll be like, wow, where did this come from? And this has literally held me in good stead on numerous occasions where I've just reached my most broke. And then I'm like, huh? Money? Yee. And then I realized I only had put that away for myself. So in these like really difficult times, like I said, even if it's like 1,000 rupees a month or 500 rupees a month, something that that just goes out of your account, like, and you don't even have to think about it and do it for like a year, 2 years, and then suddenly you'll, you know, I can't give any like sort of financial investment advice, but this is like the most basic thing that I would say like really helps.
3 golden points for the noble audience. With that, we kind of end what we known as, I don't like to end things anyway, but come to an end of this session. For the audience, I'm saying, as I said at the very start of this podcast, she doesn't need an introduction. Come on now. I'll leave all the descriptions, all the links in the description. Please do check all the shows, amazing shows out, sorry. And if you can subscribe to my channel as well. Thank you so much, ma'am, for joining. It was I don't know how to express this, but it is one of the most intense and beautiful conversations I've had till now in the playlist of Podcaster with the Podcaster.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for taking the time out to join. It means a lot. Alright, take care. Good night.